Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sky Lila Experience. Today we have Mark Gober, who is an author of several books, but today we'll be discussing The End of Upside Down Thinking. Hey Mark, how are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thanks for being here. I'm honored to have some of your time. Okay, before we get into the book, can you just tell us a little bit about your journey, either from wherever you want to start, but what I'm most interested in too is because you've had a huge shift in, I think, your way of life from the first half so far. What did that look like? Where was your journey? When did it start?
I can say that the big pivot for me was in 2016, but I'll take you even before that because I have a pretty mainstream background on the surface, and what we're going to talk about today and what's in this book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, has nothing to do with my background, ostensibly. So I went to Princeton undergrad, was very much a mainstream thinker, just wanted to achieve and succeed. I was also a competitive tennis player, so I was one of the captains of the tennis team. So you can imagine I was this like really focused athlete, wanted to do well in school. And then I went into investment banking when I graduated, like many of my classmates. And this was in 2008 when I graduated. So it was during the height of the financial crisis when I joined a large investment bank in New York called UBS. And I was there until 2010, working nonstop, not a very healthy lifestyle. But I didn't really have a sense of purpose or direction in life at the time. I just wanted to succeed. But I knew I didn't want to stay in that New York lifestyle, at least. And I left to join a firm first in Boston, Massachusetts, but then I was transferred to the Silicon Valley office near San Francisco. So I was working basically with technology-focused companies that were inventing important things, and we helped them with their patented technologies and their business strategy. And so I was doing all sorts of interesting things. I enjoyed a lot of that job because I was having to learn more about how the world works and how technology works versus what I was doing in New York. But I still didn't have a compass for my life beyond just like, beyond just like, I want to win and get the next promotion and do well with my clients. So I was basically an atheist or agnostic, I would say, at the time. I wasn't really a spiritual person in any way, didn't buy into religions. And so this takes me to 2016 while I was still working at my firm in Silicon Valley. And I started listening to podcasts that year because at the time podcasts were becoming more popular. I had friends sending me different episodes. And I started off listening to like the Tim Ferriss show, which is still on. And he was talking about psychedelics and different ways that people were just trying alternative things and their lives were shifting, but I wasn't really comfortable with the whole psychedelics thing. So I started to do other things that he talked about, like sensory deprivation tanks, where you sit in salt water and there's so much salt that your body floats and you're in the dark and there's no noise. It's sort of like an intense meditation. So I was trying things like that and then started to listen to alternative health podcasts. And then I came across one show called Extreme Health Radio, which talked about, and still is on the air, like people curing themselves of cancer using alternative treatments, that sort of thing, and different types of supplements. But one day they had a woman on talking about psychic abilities, that she was actually communicating with beings in other dimensions and things like that and helping her clients with it. So I was like, what is going on here? But these hosts, I really respected them and they were taking her seriously. This woman, her name's Laura Powers. And then Laura mentioned that she has her own podcast where she interviews other people that have had these experiences called Healing Powers. And they're pretty short episodes, so I listened to a lot of those. And I was like, wait, there's person after person, including there was a Princeton grad named Paul Davids who was a Hollywood producer and talked about how he claims he had experiences with his deceased colleagues and wrote a book about it and then a documentary. So I was like really confused, started to read books and scientific papers and realized there was actually a whole body of science that I wasn't aware of. It came from the U.S. government and their declassified programs. The Princeton University even had a lab run by the former dean of engineering, the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies, the Institute of Noetic Sciences. The point is, there was all the stuff I didn't know. Long story short, I became totally obsessed, wrote a book about it, An End to Upside Down Thinking, and then eventually left my job and have been writing a lot more. But that's the short version.
Yeah, thank you. No, I know you've been writing tons, and what I love about I've said it on my stories, but what I love about the way how you write is it's so different than, say, how I think. It's so nicely, I think your background in just the way you've been living is the perfect merge to like these two different thought worlds, where I've grew up with this thought process and education from my parents. So it's not as scientifically supported, where what I love about how you wrote was you really don't give your opinion at all. It's not about your thoughts and things like that. You're just simply presenting information and the reader can make their conclusion from it. About your writing process, were you like, at what point were you like, okay, is it the research that you love, or when were you like, I need to write a book? What was that shift? Because you really are, I feel like, honestly, well, I forget the last line, but like a revolutionary science, where it's so true. And I think I'm really excited right now, but like you're the key to expressing that, because I say it in a kind of biased way, where you say it in such a way that everyone can understand.
Well, thank you for saying that. I definitely wrote the book with an intentional style, like you said, to try to make it really objective. But when I first started this journey, I was not thinking about output or writing. I was just trying to understand, wait a second, I'm coming across data that contradicts my worldview, and now I have to rethink what it means to be a human being, and maybe there's actually purpose to life. It's not all random and meaningless. So I was just desperately trying to figure this stuff out. And it was maybe a year into that research process where I had spoken to enough friends and family members at this point. And at first I was really hesitant to talk to anyone because I didn't know anyone who believed these things. And now I know there's a massive global community on this stuff. But at the time I felt really isolated. And I started to express some of the data to friends and family members. And often the reaction was very positive. They'd say, whoa, I need to rethink a lot. That's crazy. I didn't know that existed. And then people would say, I remember that brunch we had a few weeks ago, Mark. I'm still thinking about what we talked about. So I was really excited about it, and the feedback was positive. So I got to this point where I said, there's enough data here where I can write this and feel confident that I haven't done anything too crazy, because I'm just presenting data. And I was still working at my job at the time, so I had to think about that too. Right. And fortunately, my colleagues were really open-minded, because we were so accustomed to working with inventors who were challenging paradigms. And they were like, you're presenting data. You've cited all your work. There's hundreds of citations, literally. Yeah. So I wasn't getting pushed back there, and I was still doing my job, so that was fine. And I just decided I'm going to do this. And the pivotal weekend for me, it was the 4th of July holiday, 2017. It was a long weekend. So I had multiple days where I wasn't working, and my friends were out partying. They wanted me to come hang out. And I said, no, I'm staying in my apartment. I'm going to write as much of this book as I can. And I was able to finish a big chunk of it. I just turned into an investment banker and applied it toward book writing. And the rest of the process just kind of unfolded. I got lucky to connect with a literary agent and publisher, and the rest is history, I guess. Yeah,
it's incredible. No, it's so exciting, because the way you write is such a way that I can't express. So I feel like I could just say, even I was having a conversation with my dad talking about the earth and what is it? Is it flat, or is it sphere, or what could it be? And he was like, yeah, okay. And then I said, no, you should really listen to the way Mark writes about it. He hasn't yet, but he'll get there. And I'm like, that's a way for his thought process to actually open that door and go, oh, there's a lot to support this. Maybe I should challenge that paradigm of what we've been taught.
Yeah, I want to add on to that, because I've written about so many topics. I know we're not going to focus on cosmology today, or medicine, or these other ones, or politics, but there's a common theme in terms of an approach to knowledge. Like some would call this epistemology. And the approach that I take is to ask myself, how do I know the thing that I think I know? Or if some expert says this is true, I want to understand how they got there. And what happens in our society is we're told that things are true repeatedly. And as Thomas Sowell, he's an economist, he says, I'm paraphrasing, that the repetition is sometimes mistaken for evidence. And so it's like, how do we get to the assumptions underlying the belief system, and are those assumptions valid? And most people will just believe things without examining those assumptions. And if you really ask them, they'll say, I haven't examined those assumptions. So that's the ground that I like to play on, is let's go to the core assumptions. And that's what happens in this book, An End to Upside Down Thinking as well. Assumptions about what does it mean to be a human? What's the nature of reality? And I guess I decided to devote this time to looking at the assumptions, whereas most people go along with their daily life. I can understand that and just assume, well, someone must have looked into this, so it's probably true.
Right. They just trust whoever's telling them what they've heard the most.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Okay, well, there's so many fun things that I want to discuss. I just absolutely loved it. It was great because it was just all the things that I think about, and you managed to talk about so many topics effectively but in depth. So thank you for that. But one, probably because it was towards the end of the book, is consciousness. I'm curious to whether your perspective or your data, but elaborating on where consciousness is in the body, or if it's not even in the body, it just, that really stood out to me, because now I knew my consciousness was this thing, but I thought my consciousness was in my mind, not necessarily in my brain. Sometimes I bring it down to my gut. But what, could you elaborate on consciousness, please, to begin with?
Yeah, so consciousness is something that's difficult, if not impossible, to define, because we can actually point to it. But so I'll give my best general definition, which is that it's our sense of experiencing life. Some would call it our subjective inner awareness, or some might even say that if I tell you, Sky, I am speaking to you, that sense of I is part of our consciousness. Or if I have a thought, there's a distinction in that sentence between I and the thought. So the thought enters, but there's an I that experiences the thought. So I know we're getting to really abstract stuff, but that's the realm that we're dealing with. And we kind of have to, because all of life is experienced through consciousness, and our ability even to ask questions about who we are and why we're here relies on consciousness. So this is a really important topic, and that's why philosophers have been talking about this forever. And your question is really the core of the book is, well, we know that we have consciousness because we're experiencing. It very much, at least feels like we have consciousness right now. Yeah. And we then wonder, where does that come from? Most of society and science will tell you, especially neuroscience, will say that that consciousness that we're all experiencing right now, it's solely a product of things happening inside of your skull, i.e. your brain. So there's chemical and electrical activity in your brain, and that produces your capacity for experience. And there's actually a decent reason to come to that conclusion, which is that in neuroscience, we can point to parts of the brain which, if they're activated or damaged, will shift your consciousness. So let's say someone gets in a bad car accident, a part of the brain that's correlated with vision is damaged, and then the person has a change in their eyesight. We can do this all the time. And there's actually a fancy name for it in neuroscience. They're called neural correlates of consciousness, the parts of the brain that are correlated with your consciousness. Now this is the whole potential misconception in society, which is people are confusing correlation with causation.
Right.
So they say, well, the brain's related to consciousness clearly, therefore the brain creates it. And maybe there's another explanation. So it's like the same thing where if you have firefighters that show up at a fire, you could naively conclude that the firefighters caused the fire, when in fact the firefighters are there to put out the fire. So how do we bring that back to consciousness and where it's even coming from? The way that I like to think about it is that maybe the brain is like an antenna receiver. And we're picking up our consciousness from somewhere outside the body, in the same way that if you're watching television and you take a hammer and smash the antenna on the television set, then the show that you're watching comes up scratchy on the screen, but it's not because the signal was damaged. The signal's totally fine. The only thing that changed was the apparatus that was receiving and processing the signal, the antenna, that was damaged. So it might be that the brain is like an interface. And before I pause here, it might even be that it's not just the brain that's picking up things. So there are cases of organ transplant recipients. Right. So someone, let's say they get a heart or a kidney from someone else. They sometimes take on the memories or personality traits of the person that they got the organ from.
Right.
So what's going on there? I mean, there's one case I mentioned in the book. There's a book that I got this from. It's called The Heart's Code by Dr. Paul Pearsall, where a young girl received a heart and she started to have nightmares of being murdered. And it was so severe and so detailed that her mother took her to a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist said, wait a second. And they realized that the girl had received her heart from another woman who had been murdered. And as the story goes, they were able to find the murderer of the heart donor on the basis of the recipient's memories in her dreams, because the dreams were so vivid. And that's just one example. Sometimes it's more subtle. The point is that what is going on, the mainstream view is that consciousness just comes from your brain, and when you die, that's the end. The brain creates consciousness. But here, there's a lot of evidence that maybe the brain and the body and our organs even could be picking up consciousness from way beyond the body, which would make the body like a vessel or a vehicle, and maybe there's a soul or something. So you start to get into that territory very quickly.
Oh, I love that territory. Thank you. So, on that note, though, do you think there's a universal consciousness and we're sort of all just a stream of this consciousness, or we're still our individuals on a way, or how does that separation work or unity work?
It's a really fundamental question. And the way I like to think about all my explorations is that I feel way more comfortable saying what's not true versus saying what is true. So I can point to these anomalies, these like black swans that violate the rule, because the rule is all swans are white. Then we find a black swan. Okay, you got to change the rule. That's sort of my approach. Yeah. And but that said, where I land directionally is that I think the basis of all reality is probably some kind of a universal consciousness. Mm-hmm. And then there are individuations where it feels like there's a mark in a sky in each individual person. My favorite analogy comes from Dr. Bernardo Kastrup, who I mentioned in the book in End Upside Down Thinking. He says that all of reality could be likened to an infinite stream of water, where water is analogous to consciousness. And each individual is like a whirlpool within the stream. So each of us is made of water, but it's just a different configuration. And that means that you, at some level, you're both an individual whirlpool and you're the entire stream. And this is where we get into the realm of paradox and things that are probably beyond our comprehension, where our identity might be the stream, literally, but at this moment it feels like it's just Mark or Sky, the whirlpool.
Right. Yes. Yeah, no, I think about it often because when trying to download too or just meditate, it's like, oh, what's happening here? Where though, when you said the consciousness could be, so do you think that it's anywhere in the, not you think, but that's just how I speak, but from however you want to say it, do you think it's held in different areas of the body, or it's just simply perceived, we perceive it in our mind, or are there other ways that might be more truthful? Like if you connect to your gut, do you think you could have like a deeper kind of connection of some sort or something like that? Because I know you talked about it in your legs and this and that.
I am really not sure how it works.
Okay.
It seems like the whole body somehow is picking up consciousness, and the brain is a really important part of that. Mm-hmm. So I'll give one example where the near-death experience, which I have a whole chapter on in the book, in End Upside Down Thinking, where a person is clinically dead and there's no blood flowing to the brain like in cardiac arrest or something, and yet they have a completely lucid consciousness, actually a clearer consciousness than normal, and they're hovering over their body, and then they're resuscitated, and they tell the doctors or family members what they saw from a perspective outside the body. The point here is that you have an enriched or an enhanced consciousness when the brain's out of the way. And Dr. Bruce Grayson, who's a professor at the University of Virginia, he said to me, I did a podcast series on this also. It's called Where's My Mind? Episodes 5 and 6. And also episode 2, he mentions this. We're left with this paradox that at a time when the brain isn't functioning, the mind is functioning better than ever. So it might be like the brain, at least, is some kind of an interface, not just a receiver, but almost like a filtering mechanism. Right. And when we take it out of the picture, people say, wow, I remembered who I am. I can't even describe in words how real it was. Right. So it might be that each of these parts of our body are somehow getting in the way of consciousness or filtering it in a very specific manner. Right. And the brain might be part of it. Maybe our organs have something to do with it. I don't know what the ratio is of all these things. But it just seems like our body is a vehicle or vessel. And the question you ask is really critical. And one of the reasons I wanted to write this book was that I hope that it would bring about more research to answer these questions. Because unfortunately, there's not enough funding to get into this stuff, because people are saying, no, consciousness comes from the brain. We're only going to fund that stuff.
Right. I forget that there is, I guess that's why you wrote the other books, a lot of political stuff about it and in advancing the science behind it. Oh man,
exactly.
That's another conversation. About just leading in from consciousness to near-death experience, and you talked about reincarnation quite a bit. I'll let you elaborate on that in a second, but just to bridge the gap there, the reincarnation, do you think it's the consciousness, like goes back to universal consciousness and the memories, and then that's how does that work?
Yeah. Well, first of all, before I talk about the evidence for this, because there is some really good scientific evidence, reincarnation implies linear time, that there's past to present to future, that you could have had a past life. And that's a very big presupposition. If time doesn't even exist. So some people say it feels like a past life, but actually there's no time, so it's all simultaneous. I don't know. In any event, what happens is that people seem to have memories sometimes, especially young children, which I'll talk about in a second, of a life that is not their own, and from a different time period very often. Whether that is, we don't know why that's happening, but it's pretty strong. And some of the best evidence, which I talk about in the book, comes from the University of Virginia. This is their Division of Perceptual Studies at the medical school. So very credible institution, which since the 1960s has been studying young children who have these memories, and their parents are like, what is going on here? Yeah. And sometimes the researchers can say, okay, we can find historical records that line up with what this young child is saying. And the kid might be between the ages of 2 and 6 years old. So sometimes they might even be having memories before that, but they're not verbal. They're not able to say it. But these are specific things. And sometimes the children have phobias that don't make sense, or they're called philias, things that they're drawn to that don't make any sense based on the family structure. But really, I think the most mind-blowing ones are where the children have birthmarks or physical deformities that align with how they claim to have died in this previous life, where the researchers can sometimes find medical records that say, yeah, there was a person that died this way, and whoa, this little kid's body is deformed in this very specific way. Dr. Ian Stevenson from UVA, who's now passed, he wrote a book called Where Reincarnation and Biology Intersect, which I think is one of the coolest titles ever. But actually, just yesterday, the day before this interview, I learned of a lot of money going toward advancing this research. $750,000, I believe, is the amount going toward advancing the research at the University of Virginia. Wow. And some pretty big funders. So this has been funded for a while, but I think there's momentum right now to look into this. Yes. And what does it mean? I don't know, but there's something going on. I mean, some people would say, this is just the child tapping into some other life in the stream, and it's not necessarily their own. But then it's integrated so much into their fears and the way they think about themselves, and sometimes even their bodily structure, that maybe it is some version of them, like water within the stream that was once one whirlpool. It dissolves into the broader stream, meaning that person died, and maybe part of the water gets reconfigured into a new whirlpool, and it's like some of the consciousness gets transferred. That's one possibility.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. I'm curious to the timeline of no time and space, because often when I meditate, I try to go to a space of no time and place. In terms of reincarnation, then, well, this is leading into a bit of quantum physics too. There's so many good things here. Is it all happening simultaneously? Like, kind of what's the data behind that? Besides, do we just make a timeline to make it easier for us to understand, or why do we have past, present, future?
I think we have we have the notion of sequence, past to present to future, because that's how we interpret things through the lens of our body. So it might just be our unique interpretation, and then we look at the things around us and we see things blooming and then dying, and we create this whole narrative about time. But if we think about it experientially, and we want to be really, really skeptical, we actually can't prove the past. Because even 5 minutes ago, you can show me the video of it, but the video is occurring in the present moment, and the memory we have of it is occurring in the present moment. And the same thing goes for the future. It's something we think about in the future, but it's always in the present moment. So we are never anything but here and now. That's our true experience. And anything beyond that is our inference, which we take to be very real. There's an analogy by one of my favorite spiritual teachers, Dr. David Hawkins. He said, imagine if you shine light through a prism, you end up with this big hologram. And you can look at the hologram at this point, and this point, and this point, and you see something different. But it's all just oneness of the here and now, of the light shining through, and you have a hologram in the present moment. So you could take each of the points that you see on the hologram as our interpretation of past, present, future, of sequence. But it's really just looking at different points on the oneness in one moment. And it's mind-blowing, because then you have to reconfigure how you think about all of life this way. But I think it is the most skeptical position.
Well, it's true. I was thinking about that, and from what you say in your book, but also just in general, because I play around with past and present and future in my mind of sometimes visualizing or manifesting, I'll think, okay, I'll play around with if the future, say accomplishments perhaps, are the past, then I feel grateful for them. Or I think about the past, say grief, I'm somebody that I miss. I'm like, well, what if that actually hasn't happened and I flip it and they're in the future, then I can be excited about these memories. So how do you stay so here and now and in the present moment and try to sort of release or surrender almost to those memories or aspirations in the future with the science behind it? I know that's not a very clear question, but
at first it was very challenging and disorienting, and I didn't know where I was or if I was going crazy. That's where I was for a while. And then after a period of time, it becomes just second nature because there's so much data and I've had to go through it so many times, because the topics we're discussing today about consciousness, they flow into all 7 of the books, even though they're not the main event. It's fundamental because whether it's politics or medicine or cosmology, anything, we have to know what's the nature of reality that we're in if we're going to evaluate those other things. And then we have to talk about consciousness. So it's been really deeply ingrained in me. And I've gotten to the point now where I'm just numb to it. I'm like, okay, this is reality. I'm going to deal with it. I'm going to try to take life one moment at a time. I definitely don't fear death in the way that I used to, especially after hearing case after case of near-death experiencers who will even say to me personally, like when I interviewed them for my podcast, they don't fear death. One guy said he can't wait to go back to whatever the realm was. He said, not to sound suicidal, but I can't wait. So I really don't fear death. I actually find the ups and downs of life way more challenging than death. And then that on its own is informative to me. It's like, well, maybe there's a reason for that, because it's not about the end result of the death and the birth, but it's like what we're learning while we're here. Yes. And while we're struggling and having those ups and downs, that might be the whole point of it. So that actually brings me into my life even more to say, okay, I'm really struggling through this thing. What's going on? Because I have this broader perspective. I can intellectualize and I can give you all the data for why I shouldn't be feeling this way, but I am. So what does that tell me about my own consciousness, my own whirlpool that might need to evolve in some way? And then I try to spend more time in that domain.
Yes. Do you find you ever get stumped, or just because the way you operate, you're always still curious? Or when you find, because you consume a lot of knowledge and information, do you ever get like not know what to do with it? Or how does your consciousness work in that setting?
I operate from a place where I don't think I know what's going on. And like I said, I think it's easier to show what's not true than what is true. Right. But I take the different pieces of data, and maybe I was trained to do this professionally and academically. That's why I had so much of my life doing that. And I just hold them there. And basically what happens is that when I see enough things that are in alignment, then I see a framework for how they can exist. But then I hold other things that I don't have a place for. So it requires being comfortable in not knowing. Mm-hmm. That's the only way that this can work without going crazy.
Yeah, well, that's what I was thinking, because just even this is just the first one, and I know you have 7 books now, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if all of them are as jam-packed and abundant and in-depth, it was like, oh, this man is just powering through this different path, and there's not necessarily a paved road for this stuff. Mm-hmm. So it's just curious to how your mind operates and processes all of it, because it's so different than the usual, like, okay, I found what I was looking for, now I'm satisfied. You just have an infinite curiosity level almost. But how do you find, has it been redirecting you as you learn more, which maybe it's not in this book too, do you start to propel yourself in because you're like, oh, actually this sort of leads to this, and then this is not known yet? Mm-hmm.
It's hard for me to actually explain how I've gotten into all these subjects. They seem to just enter my life in some way, and then I get hooked. And then I say, oh, I know this feeling. I've had it before. I think I need to explore this. Right. But I do find that I feel a sense of obligation and duty when I put this stuff out there, that I don't want to mislead people in any way. And every time I write a book, it's a few days later, and I'm like, I actually feel a little bit differently about this one thing. And then compound that by years, because the book you just read, and end upside down thinking, I wrote that in 2017 and it was published in 2018. Right. So it's like as I learn more, I realize I generally agree, but I would tweak this, I would tweak that, and then I'm like, I can do that in another book.
Right.
So it's like the books give me a chance to continually revise how I look at life, and on top of that, it allows me to pursue the curiosity that emerges.
Right. Well, I know you said read this one first because I wasn't sure which one. So I guess maybe each one sort of dives deeper into the topics from previous books.
Yes. I always recommend that if people actually want to read all of them, to start with the first, even though you could read just one and that would be it. And I try to make them independent enough. But if you read them in sequence, you can see the evolution in my own thinking and where I generally agree with myself, or maybe I feel slightly different about certain things.
Yes. I had listened to this one as an audiobook, and almost immediately I was like, oh, I wish I had the physical book because I need to highlight and I need to really sit with these things and process them. It's not really I mean, you could listen as you're going about your day, but they're so thought-provoking. You mentioned language ghosts. Can you elaborate? Well, one, what is it? And then two, what does it mean?
Yeah, I think you're referring to something that Bernardo Kastrup said, the philosopher I mentioned, where he talks about space and time as basically undefined concepts, because you end up with circular definitions, like time is the interval between two events. And what's an interval? It's really a unit of time. Right. So we can't even define time. And same thing with space. Like space is the distance between two things, I guess. And what's distance? You're talking about space again. So we get into these abstractions of space, time. And yeah, they're like language ghosts because we speak about them as if they're real concepts, but they're really just ways of approximating reality. And that's fundamental because space and time that's the way that we perceive the world, and they might not even exist in the way that we think. So it gets to a broader issue. Like when you ask me, what's consciousness? A great question. And I can't even answer it fully because it's not a physical thing. And that speaks to the problem with language. Language is useful in that we can communicate approximately, but it's not useful in that it's imprecise.
Do you find, how can you, using language or not using language, how can you understand something deeper, or is there a way that you almost take language out to comprehend something deeper?
Yeah. I mean, that's what a lot of people tell me, that their own personal experiences tell them everything they've needed. And that could be very extreme. It could be a near-death state, which is a risky thing to do because sometimes people, if they're in cardiac arrest, they don't always make it. Or with psychedelics, for example, someone could have a blowout experience, or sometimes in meditation. The point is that it's like the knowledge comes not from language, it comes from a knowing. That's what a lot of people say. Right.
True. Yeah. No, thank you. Do you find you feel this knowing in your body at all when you're researching something? Do you feel, besides the research that you're finding, will you feel a body sensation of like, okay, yes, move forward here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I get a feeling of excitement. That's basically what it is. And the excitement is pursue it.
Okay.
And I don't know what's real within that. Like, I mean, in the book, and End Upside Down Thinking, there's so many different topics I talk about. And the argument I make is, if any one of these things is real, not even everything that I talk about, you could critique this study or that one, but try to shoot down every single example, and it's hard to do. And I haven't had anyone come up to me, or since the book has come out, with any good arguments against every single piece of evidence. Yeah. So that excitement I had was not necessarily toward every single thing that I wrote, but rather the general picture. Right. And we could apply that to anything. So it's like, okay, Mark, you're really excited in understanding what's a human being and what's the science of psychic phenomena and the science of surviving bodily death versus like a specific targeted thing. Another one we could give an example of, my fourth book, An End to Upside Down Contact. It's on contact with non-human intelligences, whether it's someone saying they encountered a deceased relative, or some religious figure or a being of light in a near-death experience, or psychedelics, or this UFO phenomenon, which has been described throughout history. In that book, I don't claim to know what's going on at all, but there are themes that emerge. Right. And that's kind of what draws me. There's a feeling I get inside that says, okay, I'm excited about this general theme. I might not know the answer, but why don't I present all this information that I'm going to spend the time on that maybe another person, they just want the cliff notes, and I'll do it that way. And that's where the excitement comes from.
Right. No, and that's what I love about it, because it's so different than every other book I read, or when I try to do my own research. My research is more like, let's connect with my guides and see what they tell me. Do you have, side note, but a meditation practice, or what does your spiritual practice look like?
I used to meditate a lot. I had a period after I wrote this first book, An End to Upside Down Thinking. My second book's called An End to Upside Down Living. And I wrote that after going on 2 silent meditation retreats and also an Ayurvedic Panchakarma. I did those 3 retreats within 5 weeks because I had just given notice to my firm that I was going to be leaving. This was right before everything happened in 2020, where the world shut down. So when I went into those meditation retreats, which were each about a week long, there was no speaking, no gesturing at anyone else. You're in your own mind for a really long time. And I started to have some energetic sensations. But basically, since the world shut down after those retreats, and I finished writing the book and End Upside Down Living, and I just left my job, I didn't have too many obligations in life. So I was just like, I'm going to meditate a lot. And I meditated for an average of 5 hours a day for about a year.
Wow.
And then I started to get all kinds of energy pressure in my head, and I just didn't feel called to it anymore. So now my practices vary, and I don't always feel like I need to have a practice. I might meditate a little bit here and there, but I feel like life is the practice that I'm in right now, of just dealing with that and trying to flow and be in a living meditation.
Yes. Have you read The Surrender Experiment?
I have not read it. By Michael Singer?
Yes.
Yeah, I've heard great things.
I just finished it as well, and it reminded me of just what you're saying, because his then spiritual practice or meditation became life and the flow of life's events, and not being in meditation as much. So it's interesting to see that pattern, and I feel like you almost have to have the foundation, and then you get thrown into life, and that just happens for you.
That's what it feels like. And it's easy to say that. It's much more difficult to do it, because we develop, maybe out of survival and maybe out of habit, we develop attachments to things that we want to happen or things that we desperately don't want to happen. And in those cases, it's really hard to surrender.
Right. With knowing what you do, are there almost tools or sort of like strategies that you use to detach and to ground yourself again?
That word detachment is an important one. David Hawkins, who I mentioned before, the spiritual teacher, he distinguishes between detachment and non-attachment. And I like non-attachment more than detachment, because detachment is, okay, I'm disconnected from the world. I don't really care. I'm just going to sit on my couch all day because I know I'm going to survive when my body dies, and maybe I'll be reincarnated. Whereas non-attachment is, I'm going to be fully present and engaged and care a lot, but I'm not going to fixate on the outcome. I'm not going to be bound to the thing that I fear or the thing that I desire. Even though I might fear and desire them, I'm fine with that, but I'm not going to fixate on the outcome.
Right. Yeah.
And yet the I don't know, the exercise is just to like somehow in your mind say, I'm going to be okay no matter what.
Right. Right. No, that makes sense. Thanks for saying that, because it's true. Detachment, non-attachment. Detachment infers that there was something that you were attached, and non-attachment is just simply, it sounds like, just is.
Mm-hmm.
I like that. Thank you. Okay. Because I often think everyone's a mirror, and then I'm always trying to learn. I might overthink it a bit too much, and what am I meant to learn in this situation, et cetera, et cetera. But when you say we all have a one mind and infer potentially that every other being is a mirror, how does that actually play out, and how should you move forward with that concept?
It's really tricky, because it's an exercise of trying to interpret reality and come up with a simple answer when the answer might be way more complex. Mm-hmm. So it's like, I think it's both helpful to view our life circumstances as lessons that are coming at us and maybe mirrors of things that we need to look at internally. Mm-hmm. But then the danger can become fixating on our interpretation of all those events and saying this is the answer, when it might be much more multifaceted. So I think both are really important. David Hawkins used this term, radical humility, meaning just to say, I don't really know, but then at the same time acknowledging I'm seeing this pattern here. And then the trial and error with that is an individual process that only you can know. Right.
Well, I can't remember what it was in relation to, but you had the example of the tennis ball, and you hit the tennis ball, I think it was that one, and then you were like, well, did my racket really hit the tennis ball, or you took it back way out and basically to see the universe spinning or whatever it is, and it was like, okay, you're right. If you think about you could probably say that better, but all the specific circumstances that lead to something, there really is no individual influence.
Yes. So you're asking, this is a very deep topic also, of the nature of causation.
Yes.
And if we see I'm on the tennis court and I hit the ball, we could say what caused the ball to go across the net. Well, Mark's arm did, or more specifically the tennis racket did and the strings, but what caused Mark to be there to even be able to hit the tennis ball with the racket?
Yeah.
Well, his parents and all of his ancestors, and what caused them to be there? And you have to get back to the beginning of the nature of reality. And David Hawkins says this really well, that there is really no causation beyond the oneness or whatever the source of reality is. That is the only causation. And any intermediate causation, if we said the tennis racket hit the ball, it's like it's an approximation. That's not really the root cause.
Yeah, it really just made me slow down because I began to think so much broader about everything that's happening. And instead of being so close to it, it was like, ooh, it was just a nice way to sort of restructure how I think about things.
It's a loosening of our grip on tightly held beliefs, which I think is an important thing in our society because we see this, especially in the news, whether it's scientifically related or politically. People get really locked into a model of causation. Yes. This is actually something I've been talking about a lot. I should mention it now. There's a logical fallacy. The fancy name for it is affirming the consequent. But basically it goes like this. Statement 1. If it rained last night, the grass outside this morning will be wet. True statement. And here's the problem, the second statement that people often will say. The grass outside is wet this morning, therefore it rained last night.
Right.
Maybe there were other reasons the grass is wet, like it's just dew or a sprinkler system or children running by and poured buckets of water or a million other things. Right. And what happens in modern society is that we get locked into one model of causality of, well, the grass is wet because it rained last night. And then any new observations we're going to force fit into the model that it rained last night when there might be many other possibilities. And then taking it even a step further back, which is what you were getting at. Well, what's the cause of all of it? Why is the grass even there? And why is there even water? Because there's a source of reality. So we've got to really step back and just take a deep breath.
Yeah, it took me out of the day-to-day. I was going somewhere, and then it was like, man, this is such a nice thought and stream of consciousness, and I kind of want to dive into this. And then I thought, no, stay present. In this moment, you're moving to this place, and you're going there. And it was like, oh, wow. Do you find sometimes... How has your life shifted with your excitement around these topics? Have you isolated a bit more when you turn to write a book, or is it a balanced flow that the universe just happens? And then I know you've opened up a whole world to more people, so you're not necessarily isolated in this. But sometimes I find, at least for myself, when I want to dive into it all, I'm like, I don't really want to do anything in life. I just want to dive into my consciousness here. How does that influence your life?
It's definitely shifted my priorities. The things that I care about are way different. It used to be I wanted to do really well for my clients and get the promotion and do really well in my career. And not that those are bad things, but I wasn't necessarily as passionate about the subject matter. Now I take that passion toward, I want to communicate really well when I'm doing an interview or write a book really precisely and cite everything and get it right and not make a mistake. So it's just, I've shifted where my energy goes. And I've also found that relationships in my life have come and gone. There just is an alignment, is not the same alignment that I used to have with certain friends, for example. And it's not like I've had huge arguments. I mean, in some cases, there were just disagreements over things that I wrote. But in most cases, it's been pretty smooth, where it's like we've just drifted into different directions, no animosity or hard feelings. And then new people have entered my life. And it actually happens with each book I write. There's more and more hesitation toward actually writing and publishing it because it's more and more controversial. Right. And I've come over the hump and say, okay, yes, I'm going to do this. And there's fear in that process, but I do it anyway. And then I find that there's this whole new world that opens up after I make that decision. And there are some doors or just relationships or aspects of life that seem to not be as relevant, or I'm not in that path. Mm-hmm. So it's like, I think that when people go down this path, and maybe members of your audience will see this too, once you reprioritize and reconfigure the compass for where you live, your life will shift. Mm-hmm. And I can't predict exactly how it's going to happen for each person, but I've heard it from enough people. And some people say it was from, like, Mark, I read your book or I listened to your podcast, then my life shifted. Just in the same way that for me, I listened to podcasts and read books and my life shifted. There's something about opening up the door in one's mind for a new way of looking at reality that will lead you on a path of no return. And maybe it's going to be slow, maybe it's going to be fast, but you can't unsee or unhear certain things. And that necessarily shifts your consciousness.
Right. Subconsciously, it's shifting everything around you too.
Yeah.
Interesting. Just on the note of you writing in fear, because it's true, from an outside perspective, you can't see, you're confidently sharing all this information because it's so well written in a way that you almost can't, like you said, debate it almost. I mean, you can debate it, but you can't sort of prove it wrong. How have you noticed internally, have you gotten stronger at surrendering to the fear before publishing a book, or is it gone, or does it still come up as a human being and then you just move forward? What does that internal process look like?
The internal process is one where I have to get really grounded in the things that I'm talking about. And it is something that comes up time after time, because in a new book, I'm saying new things. And I have to evaluate, okay, maybe you agree with what you did in the past books, Mark, but can you really make these arguments about this new stuff? Can you really do it? And the book writing process helps me, because I'm like, okay, is the argument strong enough or not? And especially the last two, I would say the medicine book and the cosmos book.
Yeah.
I went into the writing process saying, I am not sure if this is going to be published. I'm not even sure if I can convince myself of it. But then I wrote it and found all the sources and put it all together and read it and went through the process, and I said, this is strong. This is strong, and I would feel comfortable saying it to someone, even though I know there will be the doubters and the naysayers. Yes. But this is a process I've had to go through every book. I remember my first book, An End to Upside Down Thinking. I was super excited. I said, how could anyone deny this? There's so much evidence, and I'm not even saying it's all real. Just one thing has to be real. Right. And I had one good friend of mine who was very nice to read the first draft, super smart, brilliant guy. He pulled me aside one day with another one of our close friends and was like, basically, I'm having an intervention, Mark. You cannot publish this. People are going to think you're actually crazy. And I'm your friend, and I want to tell you that.
Oh, wow.
And he didn't have, his arguments were things like, the statistics are too good, it can't be real. And he hadn't actually read the source material. But it was good to hear that mentality, because I have gotten that feedback from some people who are very angered by what I've written. Even in the first book, they'll say, I stopped reading it after the first few pages, first two chapters, I'm done reading it. And I just have to accept that I can't control how people think. All I can control is what I do.
Right, what you provide. Interesting. Thank you for sharing that, because almost I feel like to whoever's listening, in a way of moving forward with something that's uncomfortable or perhaps not supported, you're doing a great job at it. There was a lot more to say there, and then it came back, so I wanted to touch on that and how you move forward with that fear, because I could only imagine if you had it or if you didn't have it to begin with. Who knows? Yeah,
and there's also a fear of, I like getting things right. I have a perfectionistic side, and the willingness to acknowledge being wrong in a public way. Because I had that before. Maybe I would take a test and get something wrong, and that would really bug me, and maybe my teacher wouldn't think as highly of me. And then in the business world, I would have clients and then my colleagues, and if I made a mistake, then I would let them down. But here we're talking about publicly to anyone in the world to say, okay, I wrote this, and maybe I don't agree with it anymore. And to go through the process of actually revising certain thought processes, which I've done through the evolution of these books, and to get comfortable with that. So to be okay with being imperfect. That's my own journey. Oh, thank you. I love that. I was going to ask at the end for words of inspiration, but that could be one of them. It's true. I know, just a brief overview, because it's a huge topic, but quantum physics, how does that play out in consciousness, or influence consciousness, do you think, or our perception of this sort of outer world and inner world? I'm going to give you two answers. I'm going to give you the answer that I would have given when I wrote the last book, and then a revised one. Okay. So the way I discuss quantum physics in the book is, it's one of the two, I would say, two biggest and most established theories in all of physics. The other one is Einstein's relativity theory. But there's a problem, because the two theories are actually incompatible. It's in science, it's known as the failure to have a unified theory of everything. Okay. So there is this question mark, but these are like the two staples. You talk to any scientist or physicist, quantum mechanics, relativity, these are established things. So quantum typically deals with the very small things, like tiny, 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 whereas relativity often deals with the belief in like galactic, massive things. Right. But quantum, the two big findings in quantum mechanics that people find crazy. One is called entanglement, the idea that when you affect one particle in one place, there's an entangled one that's far away in space and time that's affected in the exact same way. Yes. So Albert Einstein called this spooky action at a distance. Of wait a second, is there a connectedness in the universe that we don't see with our eyes? Dr. Dean Radin, who's the chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, wrote a book called Entangled Minds, because he was trying to connect, there's evidence for telepathic communication, which I talk about in the book, peer-reviewed science, and we've got quantum mechanics. Maybe there's some connection between the two. Interesting idea. And there's another experiment, which also Dr. Radin has looked at, of basically the observer effect, where there are studies showing that whether something behaves like a wave or a particle depends on whether or not there's an observer there. The question then becomes, what's an observer? Is it a light that you're shining on something that might be affecting the experiment because you're shooting light beams? Or is the experiment affected by consciousness and the behavior of the particle, whether it's a particle or a wave? It's being steered by the mind, which is something that would fit into our discussion today. And Dr. Radin has run a number of studies on this where he's had, first it was meditators, but then I think it was just normal people, putting their mind to the experiment, this quantum experiment, to see if they can affect whether it behaves more like a wave or a particle. And he does find that it can steer the results. So there's something going on, which I think I found people are drawn to it when they say, Mark, you're talking about quantum physics and you're tying it together. That's a big deal.
That's what I loved, because that's where I find I read quantum physics books, or I'll read something out there, different topics, but it only really touches on theirs. And then what I try to do in my own head is tie it together. And do any of your other books dive deeper into that in the moment? Because I'm curious to the.
There are none that have a whole chapter on it like I do in this first book and into Upside Down Thinking. But I want to segue into where I now have questions even about quantum mechanics and relativity. So I don't talk as much about quantum in the Cosmos book. I spent a lot of time critiquing Einstein's relativity, which is a whole separate topic. But where I'm now asking questions about quantum is... There's a good webinar on this. Dr. Thomas Cowan, he's a medical doctor who's talked about all sorts of topics. He did a webinar, I think the end of 2024, where he pulls this stuff together. And also Dr. Stephen A. Young, he's a theoretical physics PhD. He wrote a book called A Fool's Wisdom. And I say this in case your audience is interested, because Dr. Young and others are starting to question the foundations of all of like atomism. Atomism is the belief in physical particles.
Right.
And a lot of quantum mechanics is talking about something behaves like a particle or a wave, but that says maybe there's a distinction, but maybe everything is literally just some kind of an energetic thing. Or as Dr. Young talks about, it's like the elements: earth, air, fire, water, and the fifth element, ether. And maybe everything that we think is a particle is just all of that stuff interacting, and we're misinterpreting things as particles. And that throws a wrench into some of this stuff. Also, with regard to quantum, like I said before, it's often regarded as existing at a very, very small scale. But reality is reality at the big and the small scale. So if something works at the small scale, shouldn't it work at the big scale too? And if not, what's the cutoff? What's the cutoff at which we're in the quantum realm versus not? And I know there are some scientists that say we've shown entanglement at very large scales, but still there is this threshold of maybe like if we should be able to know what the cutoff point is. And this is what Dr. Tom Cowan said in his webinar. So my point is, maybe we're seeing effects that we should be observing, and it's great, but there might be levels below that would challenge all of this and might make sense why we don't have a unified theory that can reconcile Einstein's relativity and quantum.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's what I often think about, because if they say there's energy and matter, right? But in reality, matter is really just small atoms and really vibrating energy, which creates the matter. So I'm like, it's all basically energy. So is this computer real? Is it not real? What makes me perceive that it's real? Could I, if I move to a different dimension in my consciousness, like move through this stuff? I don't know. Have you explored any of researching into like that?
Yeah, I guess I have to some degree in my book, An End to Upside Down Contact, because I'm talking about a lot of interdimensional experiences where people encounter beings, and it's not necessarily here in this place. It feels like it's somewhere else. You're also reminding me of the work of Joel Schaefer, and he's been putting out stuff. I think he was pretty quiet for a long time, but he's a teacher of shamanic wisdom from the Toltec tradition. Okay. He's got a great YouTube channel called The Perceiver, I believe. And a lot of what they do in the Toltec tradition, coming from Carlos Castaneda in that realm, is the dream state. And Joel Schaefer has talked a lot about experiencing himself these other realms of consciousness or other dimensions where it's actually realer than this place.
Right.
Not that it's not happening here, but other places are realer. And we hear this in the near-death experience cases. People say it's realer than real. So it's like, what actually is all this stuff? And I do remember at the end of this, my first book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, I mentioned Rupert Spira's work, who goes really deep into the mechanics of consciousness. And he does these exercises, these meditation exercises, where he asks someone to just like close their eyes and feel your back against the chair, your hand against the chair, whatever it is, and feel that and go into the nature of sensation. And what you'll realize is the belief that it's a chair you're sitting in is an inference based on what you've seen and what you're feeling. But everything that you've seen or felt or heard is literally just an experience in your consciousness. He calls it a modulation of your consciousness, which we've reverse engineered through mental gymnastics to say that there's Mark and Skyla, and you look like this, and I look like this, and there's a chair, and it feels like this, but it's all just a modulation of consciousness, which puts a big question into what's actually real.
This is me every day, and then I'm just like, all right, we'll go about our day to day, but my mind's up here. Mm-hmm. Oh man, so many more questions, but I know you have an abundance of interviews to share with the world. So 2 quick last ones before I let you go. Do you have a mantra or quote that you live by?
I don't, but one that is coming to mind that I've heard in multiple places recently. This too shall pass. And that goes to from negative experiences to positive ones, to understand the ephemeral nature and almost like the cyclical nature of life. Yes. And I try to tell myself that when I'm in a really abundant, joyful place, but also when I'm in a tough spot, that it's not forever.
I've heard that before. Yeah, it's true. It's so simple but helpful. Thank you. And one last one, words of advice or encouragement to an aspiring author. If anyone's listening to this and they're thinking about writing a book.
My advice would be don't write it unless you really, really want to write it, because there are parts of it that are less pleasant, like the editing process and the proofreading process and making sure every little thing in the PDF is right and the spacing's right, nothing's misspelled and there wasn't a missing the. And then for those who do an audiobook, which I would recommend for anyone who writes, because many people don't like to read anymore or they don't have the time, it's much easier to listen. But the audiobook editorial process. Right. You end up in a studio with an audio editor who's there recording everything, but then that editor has to put everything together, and sometimes there are mistakes, and then sometimes when you listen and there are things that you don't like about the intonation, for example, you go back in the studio and redo it. So all that stuff takes a lot of time and energy, and you have to really want to do it. That's the prerequisite, is you're super passionate about the subject. But once you're there and you say, okay, I'm fine doing all that editorial stuff, having long periods of uninterrupted time is critical. And for me, I've been fortunate that I've had those periods. And for me, the writing process usually happens over a period of several weeks, like 2 weeks plus or minus. And maybe that's faster than usual because I had a lot of training professionally and academically to do that. But I need that time where I can just sit down. I'm in the flow of what I'm writing, because if you leave and come back, then you're not in the flow. Right. So you need to have that period, whatever it is. Maybe you need multiple periods of a week or two where you're just by yourself writing. That's critical. And then taking time away from the writing and then to read it with fresh eyes. And maybe that's a few days or a few weeks. Sometimes for people, it's a few months. You'll catch things when you leave and come back.
Wow. So you've written these books in a period of 2 weeks?
Yeah. Most of them, roughly 2 weeks. The biggest exception was the first book because I was still working. So that one happened over the course of a few weekends. But I wrote probably, I think it was more than half the book in that long weekend, the July 4th weekend, where I didn't even want to sleep. And then my body would shut down. And then after I did that long weekend, I knew what the rest of the book was, and it was a matter of just filling it in and finding the right citations. But it's still, that was just a few weeks. The other ones, I mean, in End Upside Down Living, I wrote in between 2 meditation retreats, and that was a week. And then, of course, there was editing, but so I would say, that's been the range for me. It's a matter of weeks. It's like crazy because I open up a Word document and there's nothing there. And then there's a book there that I'm going to send to my publisher and hope my publisher likes it.
That's incredible. I think that's so beautiful. And I think that's so aligned with what you're meant to be doing, almost I don't know if your purpose or not, but because it seems like you can really snap into the flow and just be present and get it and create something. Create some material out of nothing. This reality, infinite reality. where can everybody find your books or your contact or anything?
Well, first, Sky, I want to thank you for all of your work, and thank you so much for
Thank
having
you.
me on to discuss these topics. I hope your audience and other people enjoy it because I love having these conversations. I heard podcasts that changed my whole life. They were the first
Yes.
dominoes. So I always remember that. I never know who's going to hear this and when. It could be like 2 years from now or something, where something that we talked about because you asked a great question sparks people's curiosity. So I want to
100.
say that. But
Yes.
if your audience is interested in learning more about my work, my website is a good place to start. It's markgober.com, markgober.com. I have a podcast series that I mentioned, Where is My Mind? It's just one season and it's bingeable. They're short episodes, 8 episodes in total. And it features clips of my interviews with people who think about the things we talked about. Where is My Mind? It's on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all the major players. And all 7 of my books are available on Amazon in hard copy, Kindle, and Audible formats. And I narrated all of the Audibles.
Yeah, it was really fun to listen to Mark's voice because before I even had our first conversation, I was like, I already know this man because I've heard his voice for 8 hours. I've heard the beginning story. It was so much fun. No, thank you so much for taking the time today and dedicating the recent aspects of your life to create these books. I've already dabbled in this stuff, but the way you present it is so beautiful. So I'm so excited for infinite amount of Mark Gober's books. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.